that it's time for our next speaker. So I will hand over to Leah, who's talking about critical reflection of a past project. Leah, over to you. And during that time, I set up my background so that I match the organizers as well. Another shout out to Michelle for creating these amazing backgrounds. Cool. I see Leah's screen.
Can see the screen okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Cool.
Mute myself now.
So yeah, it was interesting. You guys are talking about, when you're talking about MS Build, that although it was a really good format, you kind of miss the interactions. You kind of miss the kind of chats and things like that. And so that's something that I've been thinking about as well. Like recently I went to a meetup and someone just mentioned something about a project and I immediately thought, oh, that happened to me too. And it was just that kind of thing that I normally get at meetups that I haven't been getting. So at meetups, you might hear other people talk about their projects. People might talk about they're working on the latest tech and you know you're not, and it feels a bit, or you're working on old stuff. And then there's always someone who's doing something way out there that you kind of go, wow, I'm in way better position than those guys. So someone at an alt.net meeting actually talked about working on a VAX. Part of their system was on a VAX and it was over 28 years old. So yeah, it's really interesting to go to meetups and talk to other people and hear different perspectives. And it kind of puts a lot of things in context and perspective for yourself. So I've been thinking about doing this kind of thing by myself because I haven't been at meetups to talk to people about stuff. And I've been thinking about the way to kind of frame this. I was thinking of being quite critical as I posted on the meetup. That's the topic that I first thought of. But I was also thinking of different types of way of phrasing it. So you might say that you're working on a really old code base, but another way to phrase it is you could be working on a greenfields project in a brownfield environment. So I'm going to talk specifically about a project here, but I want to kind of frame it and think about how I'm kind of thinking about this. So the project I'm going to talk about is actually one that I worked on a while ago, about 2012. It's an old e-commerce website. So it's no longer live. The business was sold. So it wasn't anything to do with the website that I was working on. So the business was sold. And when the new owners bought it, they put in some software that they run globally. So the local Australian website was replaced, but the specific software that we developed locally was replaced by a global software. So the software that was developed locally was completely developed from scratch. Now there's heaps of e-commerce platforms, but these guys for some reason decided to build their own software, and it was built in about 2005. So they would have been using what would have been the latest stuff at the time. They were using ASP.NET 2.0 and SQL Server 2005. But as I said, I was working on this in about 2012. So the code base was really old. And in fact, no one at the company who had worked on the software was still there. So there was a couple of people who were doing maintenance, but they'd only get popped in when they absolutely had to, and no one really owned the project. So when I came in, I was the first person to kind of own the project and start doing some major upgrades. So given this old platform, I was thinking all the different types of things that I could upgrade, but one of the things I was really worried about was performance. So I ran heaps and heaps of different tools, trying to figure out all the different ways to analyze the performance and to see how it was all running. There's heaps of different ways to increase performance. You could just upgrade everything. Like someone mentioned, view state was often a big issue, and some of the view state on this site was absolutely massive and crazy. You could do things like putting it across multiple servers. Another thing that I'd heard about, because I've been working on the SQL Server environment for a while, was sharding the database, which I was really excited to try. But really, which ones do I really need? So to get a bit of perspective, one of the things I was doing at the time was listening to the Stack Overflow podcast. I don't know if you guys remember, but they talked about how they developed and how they were running Stack Overflow. And even at that stage, with the volume of people that they had, they were still running with one web server and one SQL Server database server. So this is what Stack Overflow were doing for their environment. So yeah, well, if it's working for them, I can't imagine that our local Australian only e-commerce website is going to need more traffic than that. So this is a way that I got some perspective here. So you can read heaps of different information, but it's really hard sometimes to get a good perspective on what is reasonable and not reasonable. I was the only developer on this project to start with. I was the only developer on this project. And so some of the things I was doing some low hanging fruit. So I actually found things like the background was a gradient GIF. I don't know if you guys remember, we used to use gradient GIFs. And someone had created one that was a full screen size. So that wasn't really needed. So all I needed to do was slice it. So I made it like a couple of K rather than a couple hundred K, several hundred K. And so the first cold load time decreased a lot. And as a consultant, I wrote that up in my report, and it ended up being in the annual report to the rest of the company to say that we did this big load time, and it literally took a couple of minutes for me to do that. So all the different plans I had for thinking about all the changes I could make, I didn't need to go quite so elaborate. There was heaps of opportunities for low-hanging fruit. So it's good to kind of get some perspective, not thinking about going in all guns blazing with all the different software and options. There was heaps of different other ways that we did some changes. I did heaps of optimization for the SQL queries. There was some really clunky stuff that was happening, and it really increased the performance. As I said, I reduced the use of view state, so that actually reduced the size of the pages. And eventually we upgraded from ASP.NET 2.0 to 4.52, which another thing too, someone came on and helped me later, and he actually came up with this technique to cache all the inventory queries. So instead of hitting the database every single time, they were actually cached. So not quite static sites, as Curtis was saying, but kind of more towards that. So I think that was a really good way to get some performance increases. But there were heaps of new features that they wanted to add. So given the opportunity to create new stuff, something I've seen at other meetups where, there was a really good talk at alt.net. They talked about the big ball of mud and how they just couldn't untangle it, and they ended up just implementing new features as microservices, and microservices were being talked about everywhere. So yeah, we decided that new features, we were going to add them as microservices. So some of the opportunities there were to create an email service. So one of the things they wanted us to add was a gift card system. Now, it was really interesting for me at the time to think, why would we want to build one from scratch? And this is where you're thinking about what you're doing on a system, where you're adding the value. Does it make sense to really build a new thing from scratch like this? The thing was, in the context, they were about to sell the business. They didn't want to, and they knew they needed to migrate the software. So if we had have built another, if we had have subscribed to another gift card system, it would probably have to be transferred over out of it. So we ended up building a web front end onto their existing gift card system. So hopefully that would have been easier for them to migrate eventually. So this email service was going to send the electronic gift cards, but also there was a whole bunch of things that hadn't been implemented in the e-commerce system, things like abandoned cart and shipping updates. So like it's been dispatched from the warehouse, things like that. So these were a lot of really, I think, good features that we were going to add. So we added a separate email service, and the email service ran separately and independently. So for some reason, I thought that a 5-minute delay between running the email jobs was long enough. So I said it was a microservice, but it was just built separately. The idea was that the service could be deployed onto another server potentially, but it was all running from the same database. So the service was running independently, and we were just using the database to check whenever there was a new thing. So we ran a job that ran every 5 minutes, checked the database to see if there were any new emails that would need to be sent out. So what happened was we discovered that 5 minutes was long enough to get a call from support. When someone didn't get their email, their electronic gift card email straight away, they got a bit worried. They called support. They called me. Now, I actually created an admin screen with a log of all the emails that had gone out. And by the time I opened it, I saw that it had come through. And so support thought that I was awesome because the email had gone through straight away. So what happened was that 5-minute delay was just long enough for someone to panic, and support thought that I was great because I fixed it so quickly. So I think after that, we changed the time. So it was really interesting that at this place, that wasn't a business critical decision, the 5 minutes. It probably wasn't a great experience for that customer, but it was a really great place to experiment and learn. So I was thinking of scaling up. I was thinking we need 5 minutes because it could take ages to run, but really the jobs never took more than a few seconds. So 5 minutes was really way too pessimistic. So in this workplace, I ended up, I could have said that it was a really old project to work on. I could have focused on all the old code and how it wasn't using all the latest tech, but instead you can actually twist it and think of it as a greenfields project, an opportunity to try and do lots of new things. So at a meetup, I guess I could say that the code base was old, but I'm doing heaps of things to update it as I work on it. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Leah. I'll do little claps. We do have just a few minutes for questions. If anyone had any questions for Leah.
I think there's an attendee who might recognize that project. I think that one of my colleagues is on.
See lots of virtual claps coming in. It's great. See. Any questions? Sounded familiar? I think that might have been your colleague there.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, well, lots of positive feedback coming in, but it looks like we don't have any questions. But thank you very much, Leah, for your presentation.